Segregation and disenfranchisement. Just a quick note, disenfranchisement and disfranchisement are the same thing. You can write it either way. It doesn't really matter, but I make that note because that can be a little confusing for some students. Also, think about this as a continuation of race relations. So we've already looked at lynch law, but then the other two parts of race relations in the South at this time were segregation and disfranchisement. So, lawmakers basically during this time period wanted to cement white solidarity and therefore white supremacy through things like segregation and disenfranchising the black vote. The thing is, looking first at segregation, after 1870, when we're looking at segregation, which I should go ahead and define, which is separate between the two races, but it's rarely going to be equal, we're going to see segregation really begins to spread rapidly. Now, the thing is, segregation had happened before the Civil War even, but now we're seeing that it's spreading across to more institutions like prisons, hospitals, where one registered to vote, horse-drawn street railroads, schools, restaurants, hotels. The thing is, while this is happening in the South, you're actually seeing some northern cities ending segregation during like the 1870s. But keep in mind, at this time period, about 95% of Black Americans lived in the South. So when Northerners are ending segregation and thus having integration, they're really giving up very little to Black people. Saying that they're going to end segregation in their town, but only one Black person lives there is not the same thing. So when we're looking at a lot of the segregation legislation, a lot of it's actually going to be focused on railroads during this time period. From the white perspective, they didn't want to share railroad cars with Black people because that might show social equality to sit with them. And of course, Black Southerners wanted equal access, because that is a sign of respectability. It's a sign of acceptance. It was a sign that they were equals and really a full part of the American system socially. The thing is, segregation laws at this time period basically required railroads to provide separate but equal accommodation for Black passengers. The problem with this would be that you would need to have like 2 first-class trains. You would need to have 2 of all the kinds of different seating arrangements, and that's really expensive. And so railroads would balk at this expense, and basically they gave Black Americans distinctly inferior facilities. Sometimes they'd refuse to sell them first-class tickets because then they didn't have to have a first-class cart for Black people as well. Or if they did sell a first-class ticket, they might treat them really roughly if they actually sat there. Now, all of this is going to come to a head, specifically within the railroads, in 1896 with the Supreme Court ruling on the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, which you actually read an excerpt from. So this case was a 7-1 decision that's going to uphold Louisiana's railroad segregation laws. They're going to say that segregation laws didn't violate the Constitution as long as railroads in the state provided equal accommodations for Black passengers and white passengers. So this is upholding separate but equal. The problem is they don't define what equal is. And so northern and southern states with Plessy v. Ferguson are going to enact all kinds of new segregation laws. And very much, generally speaking, if there were separate facilities for Black people, they're rarely actually equal. The problem was when they didn't define equal, someone could look at like this picture here and say, oh, these two things are equal because they both have the same function of getting you water. But hopefully you're looking at this picture going, these clearly are not equal. So the thing is, Black people might have tried to fight this, and in fact, they did try to fight this in different places, but there's a sense of futility to fight this issue. Plus, it would take a lot of time, expense, and it was physically dangerous. I mean, we just looked at lynch law, and this could be seen as challenging white authority. So it could get you killed to try to challenge something like this. And so this really dissuades Black people from challenging these statutes. By 1900, segregation by law is going to extend to all kind of public conveniences. We're going to see segregation by law in theaters, hotels, restaurants, parks, schools. Now, the thing is, collectively, all of these segregation statutes are going to be known as Jim Crow laws. So when people say Jim Crow laws, that is looking at segregation laws. On one hand, yes, this was all about separating the races, Black from white. But it was so much more than that. It was also really about humiliating Black people, reinforcing white solidarity, reinforcing white supremacy. The thing is, segregation on top of that wasn't just a social issue. It was an economic issue as well. We're going to see, technically, before the Civil War, there were certain trades that were really dominated by Black people. This would be things like carpentry and masonry. But during like the 1890s, white people start replacing Black people in these trades, and then they'd exclude them from all kinds of new trades. When we start getting into technology, we're going to see things like electricity, and we're getting, indoor plumbing, big thing there. And so you get new trades of electricians, plumbers, and white people would exclude Black people from joining the ranks of these professions. You get labor unions that they would exclude African Americans from. Hey, we've already seen it with the whole Farmers Alliance. We had the White Farmers Alliance, and then we had the Colored Farmers Alliance. A lot of manufacturers would turn Black people away. Now, all of this means that African Americans aren't just facing social segregation, they're also economically hurt because they're getting paid lower incomes. If they are hired, a lot of times it's the most menial and least paid jobs. This reduces their opportunity economically. And the thing is, this reduces their opportunity for things like better housing or better education for their children. So I want you to think back to the last slide, just as kind of this a little review moment. Why were Black men lynched in the South? And we're going to go ahead and push forward. Because there's one other part of the so-called Southern solution of this time period, and that is disenfranchisement. So you've got your economic and social segregation, but what about politics? So the thing is, we're seeing a lot of political instability in like the late 1880s and 1890s, and basically white leaders in the South were really determined to disenfranchise Black people altogether, because if they made it where Black people couldn't vote in the South, then they didn't have to worry about their interests when it came to politics. And once again, it reinforces white solidarity and white supremacy. The thing is, they couldn't just say Black people aren't allowed to vote because of the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment guaranteed freedmen the right to vote. Plus, at this point in time, we're going to see a Republican-dominated Congress. That being said, there's a whole lot of support for white supremacy, and a lot of people were concerned about the political instability of this time, and they just didn't want to have to worry about Black people voting. And so basically in the South, Democrats are going to have various different ways where they can disenfranchise Black people, so make sure that they can't vote, but without violating the 15th Amendment. So it would be things like they'd complicate the registration and voting process. The thing is, the more steps you put in the way of someone being able to vote, the less likely they are to vote. So if they make it hard and complicated, Black people would be less likely to be able to vote. A lot of states in the South would enact poll taxes. These are illegal today. This would require citizens to pay to vote. Well, we've already seen Black people are making less money economically because of all the other segregation and everything. So to be able to pay to vote or be able to, eat and survive, that's not really a choice you want to put someone in, unless you're trying to disenfranchise them. There's also things like they adopted the secret ballot. Now, the secret ballot or the Australian ballot is good and bad in this instance. The thing is, this is good in that basically secret ballots or Australian ballots are what we have today, in that you don't have to orally say, I'm voting for blah, 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 out loud for everyone to hear. It's a secret who you vote for. And so even if you're in a terrible relationship that your spouse or significant other wants you to vote for one person, you could vote for someone else because they're not standing next to you. They're not allowed to look over your shoulder and check who you're voting for. And so that's really important. But the way they disenfranchised Black people at this time is they took it a step further. What they would do is they would hand them literally a blank piece of paper and say, write down who you're going to vote for. The next time you go vote, I guarantee you, which, by the way, PSA, go vote. I really say this over and over in this class. Go vote, go vote, go vote. Please go vote in all your local elections, statewide elections, federal elections. Go vote in everything. Trust me, your vote does make a difference, especially in those local issues. Anyway, jumping back into disenfranchisement. So the thing is, when they adopted the secret ballot, if you go in to vote now, it basically will give you a list of these are the people running for this office. Who are you going to vote for? It can already be really hard to remember all the different people you want to vote for because there's a lot of positions a lot of times when you go in that you're voting on. If someone was to give me a blank sheet of paper and say, write down who you're voting for, I guarantee you I would not remember every single name I wanted to vote for. And think about spelling. How often would you be able to spell all of those names and make sure that you got them right so it's clear and everything? And so that's already really intimidating in today's society. Now go back to this time period, it's going to be even more intimidating for illiterate Black voters. The thing is, previous to this, ballots had used colors to identify parties. And so you didn't even necessarily have to be able to read. You would just know, oh, I'm voting for all of the blue candidates because that's this political party, or the red candidates because it's all this political party. Another way that states would disenfranchise Black voters is they would set literacy or education qualifications for voting and require prospective registrants to interpret a part of their state constitution. Thinking of the illiteracy rates, especially in the African American community at this time, that's going to keep a lot of Black people from voting. However, you might be going, wait a second, weren't there a lot of poor and uneducated white people at this time? And you would be correct. The thing is, when these states put forward these techniques of disenfranchisement, a lot of times it could accidentally or purposely disenfranchise poor white voters as well. But a lot of times they didn't actually want to disenfranchise poor white voters. And so they would have things like grandfather clauses. Now, really quick note, grandfather clauses do not disenfranchise Black people. Grandfather clauses make sure poor white people aren't disenfranchised. So grandfather clauses basically would say that, oh, you get to automatically vote and don't have to pass that literacy test or that poll tax and things like that, as long as your grandfather voted prior to 1867. You're grandfathered in. Now, that being said, a lot of lawmakers sold white citizens in the South on all of this disenfranchisement techniques with the promise that it is only going to apply to Black voters. But actually, a lot of this was used against white voters as well, and it really does hurt like the populist uprising. So giving you some numbers, because I love numbers. In 1880, minority parties made up about 40% of the statewide vote, which is a big deal. Think about third parties today and how many people vote third party versus the main two parties. So the thing is, in the mid-1890s, despite the fact that there's a populist surge in the South, and so really this 40% should have risen to a larger percentage, it actually goes down to only about 30% because turnout is dropping. And a lot of this is because of disenfranchisement techniques that are not just being used against black voters, but also against white voters who would have voted not the way the Democratic Party wanted them to. But really, when we're looking at this disenfranchisement, it affects more than anyone else black voter turnout. Black people would protest disenfranchisement, but it really falls on deaf ears. And keep in mind, any protest could bring the danger of the so-called lynch law to their back doorstep. So I ask you this question: how do we see segregation and disenfranchisement today? How is it similar to then? Is it different groups that we see being disenfranchised or segregated out? Is it the same groups? In what way do these things still exist? And I guarantee you they do today.